If you're over 60 and you trust your children completely, let me tell you something that could save your life. Family betrayal cuts deeper than any stranger's knife. When your own son looks you in the eye over Sunday dinner and tells you that your home, the house you've lived in for 46 years, isn't suitable for you anymore, it's not a suggestion. It's a death sentence wrapped in fake concern. Mama, maybe it's time you looked into someplace more suitable for someone your age. Those words hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs and making my hands shake so violently I had to set down my coffee cup. My heart pounded against my ribs as I watched my son Danny and his wife, Kimberlyn, exchange that look, the one that said they'd already decided my fate without me. But they had no idea what this unsuitable old woman was about to do next. I'm here in my terrace apartment in Aix-en-Provence, France, sipping my morning café au lait while the Mediterranean sun warms my face. My name is Vera Louise Whitmore. I'm 67 years old, and I used to live in a little ranch house on Dogwood Lane in Branson, Missouri. Used to being the key words. Because the woman who lived there, the woman who would have meekly accepted being discarded by her own family, she doesn't exist anymore. What you're about to hear is how my own son tried to steal my $1 million estate by convincing me I was too old and confused to live independently. How he and his wife had already picked out my nursing home, calculated the monthly fees, and planned to move into my house before I was even gone. And how I gave them the shock of their greedy lives by disappearing with everything they thought belonged to them. Tell me in the comments what you're doing right now while you listen to my story. Are you having your morning coffee, folding laundry, or maybe taking a quiet moment for yourself? Hit that like button because each like is so important to help my voice reach other women who need to hear this warning. And subscribe to Grandma's Legacy because no woman should ever feel alone when her own family turns against her. That March Sunday started like any other. I'd spent all morning preparing Danny's favorite meal, pot roast with carrots and potatoes, fresh cornbread, and my famous coconut cake that had won 3 blue ribbons at the Taney County Fair. The dining room table was set with my good china, the same pattern Earl and I had received as wedding gifts 46 years earlier. I thought I was hosting a family dinner. I had no idea I was attending my own funeral. The conversation seemed normal at first. Danny complimented the pot roast, Kimberlyn talked about her pregnancy, and I shared news from church. But then Danny cleared his throat and took his wife's hand, and I knew something terrible was coming. Actually, Mama, there's something we need to talk to you about, he said, looking around my dining room like he was already redecorating it in his mind. That's when he delivered those devastating words about finding somewhere more suitable for my age. Kimberlyn immediately jumped in with her rehearsed speech about Golden Sunset Manor and their wonderful activities and professional care. $5,200 a month, they said. For the privilege of being warehoused with strangers while they took over the life Earl and I had spent decades building. I thought love meant putting family first, but I was about to learn that sometimes family puts you last. Let me take you back to where this story really begins. Not in that devastating kitchen conversation, but in 1978, when Earl and I were young and full of dreams. We'd been married for 2 years, saving every penny we could scrape together from my nursing job at Branson Medical Center and his work at Johnson's John Deere dealership. We finally had enough for a down payment on our own little piece of the American dream, a modest ranch house on Dogwood Lane, just outside the tourist bustle of downtown Branson. I remember the day we signed those papers like it was yesterday. The house cost $32,000. Seemed like a fortune then, but Earl said, "Vera Louise, this is where we'll raise our children and grow old together." The realtor, a kind woman named Mrs. Bessie Crawford, handed us those keys and said, "You young folks are getting a real gem here. This house has good bones." Good bones. That phrase stuck with me through everything that followed. Those early years were a whirlwind of hope and heartbreak. Earl was determined to work his way up to owning his own dealership someday, putting in 60-hour weeks and studying every manual John Deere published. I was pulling double shifts at the hospital, sometimes working 3 days straight during flu season. We were both bone-tired most of the time, but we had our plans. First, we'd get the house exactly how we wanted it. Then we'd start our family. Then, maybe when we were 50 and the kids were grown, we'd take that dream trip to Paris we kept talking about. Life had other plans. In 1981, I got pregnant with our first baby. Earl was over the moon, already picking out names and converting the spare bedroom into a nursery. He painted it the softest yellow, since we didn't know if we were having a boy or girl. But at 12 weeks, I lost that baby. The doctor, a gruff old man named Dr. Henderson, said these things just happened sometimes. Nothing you did wrong, Mrs. Whitmore. Try again when you're ready. We tried again in 1983. This time, I made it to 16 weeks before losing another baby, a little girl we'd already named Sarah May. Earl held me in that hospital bed while I sobbed, promising we'd keep trying, that our family was meant to be. But month after month, year after year, it just didn't happen. By 1987, we'd been through 3 miscarriages, and the doctors were suggesting we consider other options. I was 30 years old and felt like my body had betrayed me. Earl never once made me feel like it was my fault, but I carried that guilt anyway. That's when I threw myself into creating something beautiful that would last. If I couldn't nurture children, I'd nurture the most spectacular garden Missouri had ever seen. I started with 20 rose bushes, mostly hardy varieties that could handle our unpredictable Ozark weather. But as the years went on, I became obsessed. I ordered catalogs from English rose companies, learned about soil pH and companion planting, spent every weekend at nurseries in Springfield looking for rare varieties. Earl indulged my passion completely. When I wanted to expand the garden to include heirloom tomatoes and herbs, he built raised beds. When I discovered David Austin roses and their extraordinary fragrances, he helped me special order varieties from England. Our grocery budget might have been tight, but Earl never complained about money spent on plants. By 1990, people were driving from as far as Kansas City just to see our garden during peak bloom season. The Branson Daily News ran a feature story with the headline, "Rose Lady of Dogwood Lane Creates Neighborhood Showpiece." I kept that newspaper clipping in my recipe box for 34 years. Then, in 1992, when I was 35 and Earl was 38, the miracle happened. I was late, but I'd been late before and learned not to get my hopes up. This time felt different, though. I was exhausted in a way that felt hopeful. When Dr. Henderson confirmed I was pregnant, Earl actually cried in the examining room. Danny Ray Whitmore was born on March 15, 1981, weighing 7 pounds, 4 ounces, with a full head of dark hair and Earl's brown eyes. After all those years of loss and disappointment, holding my healthy baby boy felt like winning the lottery and finding God all at the same time. Maybe that's why I spoiled him from day one. Maybe losing those other babies made me hold on too tight, give too much, say yes when I should have said no. Earl used to joke that Danny had me wrapped around his little finger before he could even walk. "Vera Louise," he'd say, "that boy's going to expect the world to revolve around him if you keep this up." But I couldn't help myself. When Danny wanted guitar lessons, I picked up extra shifts to pay for them. When he needed new baseball cleats every season because his feet grew so fast, I made it happen. When he decided he wanted to go to Missouri State University instead of the community college we could afford, Earl and I took out a second mortgage to cover the difference. We kept postponing that Paris trip. First it was when Danny graduates high school, then when Danny graduates college, then when Danny gets established in his career. Somehow there was always a reason why Danny's needs came before our dreams. And I was fine with that. I thought that's what good parents did. Danny graduated with a business degree in 2003, moved back to Branson, and opened his own auto repair shop with money from Earl's retirement fund. He was 34, ambitious, and confident he could build something successful. Earl and I were so proud. Our son, the entrepreneur. But success didn't come as easily as Danny expected. Competition was fierce in a small town, and Danny had expensive tastes. He wanted the latest diagnostic equipment, a fancy storefront, and a lifestyle that matched his ambitions rather than his actual income. That's when the borrowing started. Just $5,000 to get me through this rough patch, Mama. Then it was $10,000 for new equipment, then $15,000 when a big customer didn't pay on time. Earl and I said yes every time because you help family. That's what you do. By 2018, we'd loaned Danny over $35,000. Not once had he paid back a single payment, but Earl was starting to worry. I found him one night in his home office, staring at spreadsheets and shaking his head. "Vera Louise," he said, "I love that boy, but we need to stop enabling him. We're supposed to be planning our retirement, not funding his mistakes." That was Earl, always thinking ahead, always practical. He'd started having chest pains that year, and Dr. Martinez was concerned about his heart. Earl knew something I didn't want to face. Our time together was running shorter than we'd planned. "Promise me something," Earl said that night. "If anything happens to me, don't let Danny take advantage of your good heart. That boy needs to learn to stand on his own 2 feet." I promised, but I didn't really think I'd need to keep that promise anytime soon. Earl passed away on March 18, 2021, just 3 days after Danny's 40th birthday. It was a massive heart attack in his sleep. The doctor said he never would have felt any pain. One minute, my husband of 45 years was snoring next to me, and the next minute, he was gone. The grief was crushing. Not just the loneliness, but the guilt. All those years we'd planned to travel, to take that Paris trip, to see the world together when we retired. We kept putting it off for tomorrow, and suddenly there were no more tomorrows. Danny was wonderful during those first few months. He handled all the funeral arrangements, helped me navigate Earl's insurance policies, and checked on me every day. I thought maybe losing his father had matured him, made him realize how precious family really is. I had no idea he was actually calculating exactly how much I was worth. Looking back now, I can see all the signs I missed, but grief makes you blind to everything except the pain. The changes in Danny started small, so subtle I convinced myself I was imagining things. About 6 months after Earl's funeral, when the casseroles from church ladies had stopped coming, and I was learning to cook for one person again, Danny began showing up more often. Not just the Sunday dinners we'd always shared, but random Tuesday afternoons and Thursday evenings. At first, I was thrilled. My boy was checking on his old mama, making sure I wasn't getting too lonely in that big house. He'd sit at the kitchen table where his father used to read the paper, drinking sweet tea and asking about my day. "How are you managing everything, Mama? This house is a lot of work for one person." Those conversations felt caring at the time. Now I realize they were reconnaissance missions. Danny would walk through the house like he was seeing it for the first time, commenting on things that needed updating. "These wood floors could use refinishing. The kitchen cabinets are looking pretty dated. Mama, when's the last time someone inspected that roof?" I'd explain that Earl and I had always maintained everything properly, but Danny would shake his head with this concerned expression. "I know y'all tried your best, but things change when you get older. Your eyes aren't as sharp. Your judgment might not be what it used to be." My judgment? I was 64 years old, not 94. I could still read the fine print on my prescription bottles and balance my checkbook to the penny. But Danny had this way of making me second-guess myself, like maybe I wasn't seeing things clearly anymore. Then he met Kimberlyn Bradshaw at a barbecue joint in town. She was 36, divorced, working as a receptionist at a chiropractic office, and according to Danny, she was the most beautiful woman in Missouri. I'll admit, Kimberlyn was striking. Long blonde hair, bright blue eyes, and one of those smiles that looked perfect in photographs. But there was something calculated about her sweetness, like she'd practiced it in a mirror. Their courtship was a whirlwind. Within 3 months, she was practically living at Danny's apartment above his auto shop. Within 6 months, they were engaged. And suddenly, my Sunday dinners included a woman who had very strong opinions about my cooking, my decorating, and my general approach to life. "Mrs. Whitmore," she'd say in this honey-sweet voice, You are just so lucky to have such a devoted son. Danny worries about you constantly." Then she'd look around my kitchen with this pitying expression. "This house has so much potential. Have you ever considered updating? Maybe making it more modern?" Modern. That became Kimberlynn's favorite word. My rose garden wasn't modern. It was high maintenance and old-fashioned. My furniture wasn't modern. It was dated and impractical. My entire way of life wasn't modern. It was stuck in the past and probably unsafe for someone my age. The wedding was in October 2022, a small ceremony at First Baptist Church followed by a reception in the fellowship hall. I paid for Kimberlynn's dress, $800 for something she wore for 4 hours, and covered the catering because Danny said his auto shop was having a slow month. Earl would have put his foot down, but Earl wasn't there to protect me from my own generosity. After the wedding, the visits became more frequent and more pointed. Danny and Kimberlynn would arrive together, always with some new concern about my welfare. The steps to my front porch were dangerous because they didn't have railings. My car, a perfectly reliable 2019 Toyota Camry with only 32,000 miles, was too big for me to handle safely. My habit of working in the garden early in the morning was risky because I might fall and no one would find me for hours. Every conversation became an intervention disguised as caring. "Mama," Danny would say, "Kimberlynn and I have been talking. We think you should add my name to your bank accounts just in case something happens, for emergencies." When I hesitated, Kimberlynn would jump in with her practiced concern. "Mrs. Whitmore, what if you had a stroke or something? Danny would need to be able to pay your bills and handle your affairs. It's just smart planning." They made it sound so reasonable, so responsible. And I was still grieving, still adjusting to making decisions alone after 45 years of partnership. In November 2022, I went to Branson Community Bank and added Danny as a joint owner on my checking and savings accounts. That was my first mistake, but it wouldn't be my last. The financial conversations escalated quickly after that. Danny started asking detailed questions about my assets. How much was the house worth? What about Earl's life insurance? How much was coming in from Social Security and my pension? He framed it as helping me organize my finances, but I noticed he was taking notes. Meanwhile, Kimberlynn was conducting her own campaign of psychological warfare. She'd arrive at my house with decorating magazines, pointing out modern, senior-friendly designs, and talking about how much easier my life would be in a smaller, more manageable space. She'd move things around while I was in the bathroom, my reading glasses, my car keys, my coffee cup, then act concerned when I couldn't find them. "Mrs. Whitmore, are you feeling okay? You seem a little scattered lately. Maybe you should see Dr. Martinez about your memory." There was nothing wrong with my memory. But when someone keeps suggesting you're losing your grip on reality, you start to doubt yourself. Was I becoming forgetful? Was I imagining the way she'd smirk when Danny wasn't looking? The garden became another battleground. Kimberlynn would walk through my roses with this pained expression, sighing about how much work it must be to maintain all these plants. She'd suggest I simplify by removing the older bushes and creating a low-maintenance landscape with maybe some nice artificial turf. Artificial turf, in place of 30 years of carefully cultivated David Austin roses. Think about it, Mrs. Whitmore. No more watering, no more pruning, no more worrying about pests or diseases. You could just sit back and relax instead of being a slave to all this yard work. When I tried to explain that gardening wasn't work to me, it was joy, therapy, and Earl's living memorial all rolled into one, she'd pat my hand like I was a confused child. I know change is hard at your age, but sometimes we have to accept that we can't do everything we used to do. At your age. She was only 28 years younger than me, but she talked like I had one foot in the grave. The pressure increased steadily through 2023. Danny started bringing up retirement communities during every visit. Not assisted living, he was too smart for that direct approach, but active senior communities where I could make friends with people your own age and have activities planned for you. Just look at these brochures, Mama. Golden Sunset Manor has a beauty salon, organized crafts, and they handle all the cooking and cleaning. Wouldn't that be easier than rattling around in this big old house by yourself? When I pointed out that I loved my house, my garden, and my independence, Danny would exchange those looks with Kimberlyn, the kind of looks that said, she's not thinking clearly anymore. In January 2024, Kimberlyn announced she was pregnant. The news should have made me happy, my first grandchild. But something about the timing felt calculated. Within a week, they were talking about needing more space, looking at houses they couldn't afford, and making comments about how my house would be perfect for a growing family. "Just think, Mrs. Whitmore," Kimberlyn said. "This baby could grow up in the same house where Danny learned to walk. Wouldn't that be special?" The implication was clear. I should move out so they could move in. My house, which Earl and I had paid off through decades of hard work, should become their family home while I gracefully relocated to whatever senior facility they deemed appropriate. That's when I started noticing money disappearing from our joint accounts. Small amounts at first, 200 here, 500 there. When I asked Danny about it, he had explanations. Car repairs for his shop, emergency expenses, investment opportunities that would help secure our family's future. Our family. As if my money had somehow become community property. By February 2024, I was lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out how my loving son had become a stranger who talked to me like I was a burden. How had the daughter-in-law I'd welcomed with open arms turned into someone who cataloged my every weakness and magnified my every uncertainty? I was still holding on to hope that this was temporary stress from the pregnancy, or financial pressure from the auto shop, or maybe just the normal growing pains of a young marriage. I kept making excuses for them because the alternative, accepting that they were deliberately manipulating me, was too painful to face. But deep down, in the part of my heart that still heard Earl's voice warning me to protect myself, I knew something was terribly wrong. I kept telling myself that family was everything. But I was about to discover that not everyone who shares your blood deserves your trust. The breaking point came on a Sunday morning in March 2024, during what I thought would be just another family dinner. I'd spent all morning preparing Danny's favorites: pot roast with carrots and potatoes, fresh cornbread, and my famous coconut cake that had won 3 blue ribbons at the Taney County Fair. The dining room table was set with my good china, the same pattern Earl and I had received as wedding gifts 46 years earlier. Kimberlyn was showing now, about 4 months along, and I'd been knitting baby blankets in soft yellow and green. I was excited to show them the little booties I'd finished that week, imagining holding my grandchild in those same hands that had once hoped to hold my own babies. The conversation started normally enough. Danny complimented the pot roast. Kimberlyn talked about her doctor's appointments, and I shared news from church. Mrs. Ruby Mae Thornberry had broken her hip, and the quilting circle was organizing meals for her family. The Spring Garden Club was planning their annual tour, and they'd asked if they could include my roses again this year. "That's nice, Mama," Danny said, but I caught him exchanging a look with Kimberlyn, one of those loaded glances that seemed to say, "Now's the time." I was serving the coconut cake when Danny cleared his throat and took Kimberlyn's hand. "Actually, Mama, there's something we need to talk to you about." My fork paused halfway to my mouth. Something in his tone made my stomach clench. Kimberlyn and I have been doing a lot of thinking since we found out about the baby, about the future, about what's best for everyone. He looked around the dining room like he was seeing it for the first time. "This house is getting to be a lot for you to handle. We're worried about you being here all alone." "I'm not alone," I said quietly. "I have my neighbors, my church family, my garden." "But what if something happened?" Kimberlyn interrupted, leaning forward with that practiced expression of concern. "What if you fell in the garden and couldn't get help? What if you had a medical emergency in the middle of the night?" "I have one of those alert buttons," I reminded them, "the kind that calls for help if I need it." Danny waved that away like it was nothing. "Those gadgets aren't foolproof, Mama." And honestly, maintaining this place is getting beyond what someone your age should be handling. The yard work alone is dangerous. All those thorns on the roses, the heavy watering, the ladder work for pruning. I'd been gardening for 30 years without a single serious injury, but I let him continue. "We've been looking at some really nice places," Kimberlyn said, pulling out a glossy brochure. "Golden Sunset Manor is absolutely beautiful. They have organized activities, 3 meals a day prepared by professional chefs, housekeeping services, and on-site medical care. You'd make so many friends with people your own age." I stared at the brochure. The cover showed elderly people playing bingo in a sterile-looking recreation room, their faces painted with the kind of forced cheer you see in pharmaceutical commercials. "With the baby coming," Danny continued, "we really need to think about getting a bigger place. And honestly, this house would be perfect for a growing family. It has that big backyard for kids to play, plenty of bedrooms, and it's already paid off." There it was, the real reason for this conversation. "You want me to give you my house?" I said. It wasn't a question. "Not give," Kimberlyn said quickly. "We'd work something out. Maybe you could sell it to us for a fair price, and that money could help pay for your care at Golden Sunset Manor." "The monthly fee is $5,200, Danny added. "But with the house sale and your other assets, you'd be completely covered. No financial worries at all." I set down my fork and looked at these two people who had just calmly suggested I sell my home, the house Earl and I had spent 46 years making into our sanctuary, so they could play house while I ate institutional food and played organized crafts with strangers. "I see," I said quietly. "And what if I said no?" The silence that followed was deafening. Danny shifted in his chair, and Kimberlyn's smile faltered for just a moment before snapping back into place. "Well," Danny said finally, "we'd hope you'd think about what's best for everyone. The baby's going to need stability, and we can't provide that while we're constantly worried about you living alone in this big house." "Constantly worried," I repeated. "About me living in the house I've lived in for 46 years. The house I've maintained perfectly well for 3 years since your father died." "Mama, you're not thinking clearly," Danny said, and there was an edge to his voice now. "This isn't about what you want. It's about what's practical, what's safe, what makes sense at your stage of life. My stage of life. Like being 67 meant I was already half in the grave." "You know what?" I said, standing up from the table. "I think I need some time to process this conversation. Why don't you two head on home, and we'll talk about this later." Kimberlyn's mask slipped completely then. "Mrs. Whitmore, we're not asking for much. We're offering you a chance to live somewhere safe and appropriate while helping your son provide for his family. I would think any loving mother would want to do that." Any loving mother. The manipulation was so blatant, I almost laughed. "Oh, I am a loving mother," I said, collecting the dessert plates with hands that were surprisingly steady. "Which is why I've spent 67 years putting everyone else's needs before my own. But I'm also Earl Whitmore's widow, and he taught me to think carefully before making big decisions." Danny's face darkened. "Dad's been gone for 3 years, Mama. You can't keep using him as an excuse to avoid reality. Using Earl as an excuse. My husband of 45 years reduced to an excuse." That night, after they left with barely civil goodbyes, I sat in Earl's old recliner and thought about everything that had just happened. The calculated timing of the conversation, the prepared brochures, the way they'd tag-teamed me with rehearsed arguments, the assumption that I would simply roll over and give them everything they wanted. That's when I remembered Earl's safe. He'd installed it in the back of our bedroom closet years ago, behind a panel that looked like part of the wall. I'd almost forgotten about it in the 3 years since his death, but suddenly I needed to see what he'd left there. Inside, along with our important papers and some emergency cash, I found an envelope with my name written in Earl's careful handwriting. Inside was a letter dated just 2 months before he died. "My dearest Vera Louise," it began. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone and you're having to make decisions alone." I hope I'm wrong about what I'm going to write next, but I need to tell you some things I couldn't say while I was alive. Danny has borrowed $37,000 from us over the years. I kept track, even when you didn't want to. He's never paid back a single dollar, and he's never shown any intention of paying it back. I think he sees our money as his inheritance, available whenever he needs it. I've been watching him look at this house differently lately, like he's already planning what he'll do with it when we're gone. And that girl he's with, she's got calculating eyes, Vera Louise. She smiles at you, but she watches everything we have like she's taking inventory. I know you love that boy, and I love him too. But love doesn't mean letting someone take advantage of your good heart. If something happens to me, and if Danny starts pressuring you about money or the house or moving somewhere you don't want to go, promise me you'll protect yourself. You are stronger than you know, smarter than you give yourself credit for, and worth more than you've ever believed. Don't let anyone, not even our son, convince you otherwise. All my love, always and forever, Earl. I read that letter 3 times, tears streaming down my face. Earl had seen what I'd been too loving, too trusting, too hopeful to see. Our son had become a stranger who viewed his parents as assets to be managed rather than people to be loved. The next morning, I called in sick to the church quilting circle and drove to Springfield to see a lawyer. Dolores Chen came highly recommended, a sharp woman in her 50s who specialized in elder law and estate planning. When I told her what had happened at Sunday dinner, her expression grew grim. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest. Has Danny taken any money from your joint accounts without discussing it with you first?" I nodded, and she pulled out a legal pad. "How much and over what time period?" When I told her about the withdrawals I'd noticed, $78,000 over the past 18 months, Dolores's jaw tightened. "That's financial exploitation, Mrs. Whitmore. Just because his name is on the accounts doesn't give him the right to withdraw money for his personal use without your knowledge or consent." She explained my legal options, but more importantly, she explained something I hadn't realized. I still had power. Real power. The house was in my name only. My investment accounts were in my name only. The joint checking and savings accounts could be closed and reopened in my name only. "The question is," Dolores said, "what do you want to do about it?" For the first time in months, I felt something I'd almost forgotten: control over my own life. "I want to know exactly how much money I have," I told her. "All of it. Every account, every asset, every investment. And then I want to know what my options are." Dolores smiled. "Now you're talking like Earl Whitmore's wife." When I left her office 2 hours later, I had a complete financial inventory and a very clear understanding of my situation. Earl had been an excellent provider and a careful saver. Between my savings, his life insurance, my pension, Social Security, and the 40 acres of Ozark farmland I'd inherited from my mother, I was worth approximately $1.2 million. More than enough to live exactly how I wanted to live, wherever I wanted to live, for the rest of my life. That evening, Danny called to check on me and ask if I'd thought any more about our conversation yesterday. "I have," I told him. "I've thought about it quite a bit." "Good," he said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "We can tour Golden Sunset Manor this weekend if you want. I think you'll really like it once you see it." "Actually, Danny, I think I need more time to consider all my options." There was a pause. "What options, Mama? We found you the perfect place. It's safe, it's social, and it's exactly what someone in your situation needs." Someone in my situation. A burden to be managed. "We'll see," I said. "We'll see." I was done being managed, manipulated, and underestimated, but they had no idea what was coming next. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but once it started, it moved with the precision of a Swiss watch. Over the next 6 weeks, while Danny and Kimberlyn continued their campaign to convince me I was incompetent, I was systematically dismantling the financial trap they thought they'd set for me. My first stop was Branson Community Bank, where I'd done business for over 20 years. The branch manager, Patricia Hendricks, had known Earl and me since we first opened our account. When I explained that I needed to close the joint accounts and open new ones in my name only, her expression told me she'd seen this scenario before. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said carefully, "I have to ask, are you being pressured into making these changes?" "Quite the opposite," I told her. "I'm protecting myself from pressure." Patricia nodded and processed the paperwork without another question. Within an hour, Danny's access to my money was completely cut off. I kept enough in the old accounts to cover the automatic payments, but transferred everything else, over $360,000, into new accounts he knew nothing about. The next phase required more delicate maneuvering. I needed to liquidate assets without raising suspicion, and I needed to do it quickly. The 40 acres of farmland in Tennessee that I'd inherited from my mother was my first target. It had been sitting unused for 15 years, generating small lease payments from a neighbor who grew soybeans on it. Through Dolores Chen's connections, I found a conservation group called Ozark Land Trust that specialized in preserving family farms. They offered me $365,000 for the land, almost twice what I'd expected, with the promise to keep it in agricultural use forever. The sale closed in 3 weeks. While that was processing, I had a conversation with Ruby Mae Thornberry that changed everything. Ruby Mae had been my next-door neighbor for 18 years. At 78, she was sharper than most people half her age, and she'd been watching the way Danny and Kimber Lynn treated me with growing concern. On a Thursday morning in April, she came over for our usual coffee on the back porch, looking unusually serious. "Vera Louise," she said, "I need to tell you something, and I hope you won't be offended." I poured her coffee and waited. "That daughter-in-law of yours has been asking me questions about you, about your health, your memory, whether I've noticed you being confused or forgetful. She's fishing for ammunition, honey, building a case that you're not competent to live alone." My coffee cup rattled against the saucer. "What did you tell her?" "I told her you're sharper than she'll ever be and that she should mind her own business." Ruby Mae's eyes flashed with anger. "But Vera Louise, I've seen this before. My sister went through something similar with her stepson. They'll use anything you say or do against you. You need to be very careful." That conversation was my wake-up call. They weren't just planning to take my house, they were building a case for taking my independence completely. If they could convince people I was mentally incompetent, they could gain conservatorship over all my assets. I spent that afternoon researching conservatorship laws in Missouri. What I learned terrified me. Adult children could petition the court to declare their parents incompetent based on testimony from neighbors, doctors, and family members. Once a conservatorship was granted, the adult child controlled everything: where their parent lived, how their money was spent, even who they could see or talk to. It was legal kidnapping, and it happened to thousands of elderly Americans every year. That night, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. I was leaving Missouri, not just the house, not just Branson, but the entire state. I was going to disappear so completely that Danny and Kimber Lynn would never be able to find me or control me. But first, I needed help. Real help, from people I could trust completely. The next morning, I drove to First Baptist Church and asked to speak privately with Pastor Williams. James Williams had been our pastor for 12 years, and he'd officiated at Earl's funeral. More importantly, he'd seen enough family conflicts to understand what I was facing. "Pastor," I said, "I need to ask you something in complete confidence. If someone in this congregation was being manipulated and financially abused by their own family, what would you advise them to do?" He studied my face carefully. "I'd tell them to protect themselves by any legal means necessary. And I'd remind them that honoring your father and mother doesn't mean allowing yourself to be destroyed by your children." I told him everything. The pressure to move to Golden Sunset Manor, the missing money from my accounts, Kimber Lynn's campaign to make me seem incompetent, Earl's warning letter, and my growing fear that they were planning to have me declared unfit. Pastor Williams listened without interruption, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said finally, "what you're describing is elder abuse. Financial, emotional, and psychological abuse. You have every right to protect yourself, and you have the support of this church family in doing whatever you need to do." That support became crucial over the following weeks. Pastor Williams quietly reached out to the women in our congregation, the quilting circle, the church auxiliary, the prayer group, and asked them to keep an eye on me. Not surveillance, but protection. A network of 70-year-old guardian angels who understood exactly what was happening and were ready to help. Meanwhile, I was planning my escape with the precision of a military operation. Through an online search, I discovered Château de Lavande, an exclusive retirement community in Aix-en-Provence, France. It wasn't assisted living. It was luxury independent living for wealthy retirees who wanted to spend their golden years in the south of France. The website showed a beautifully restored 18th century chateau surrounded by lavender fields, with 65 private apartments, gourmet dining, cultural excursions, and full concierge services. The cost was €4,800 per month, about $5,200, which was exactly what Danny and Kimberlyn wanted me to pay for Golden Sunset Manor. The difference was that I'd be living in Provence instead of prison. I called their international office and spoke with a lovely woman named Brigitte Moreau, who explained their application process. They required proof of financial stability, a health clearance from a physician, and references from current or former neighbors or employers. The waiting list was usually 6 months, but they had one apartment available immediately due to a cancellation. "Madame Whitmore," Brigitte said in accented English, "we would be honored to welcome you to our community. Many of our residents are Americans who chose to spend their retirement years in France. You would fit in beautifully." Within a week, I had submitted my application, provided financial documentation showing my net worth, and gotten a clean bill of health from Dr. Martinez. Ruby May, Pastor Williams, and Mrs. Opal Dean Fletcher from the Quilting Circle provided glowing references attesting to my character and competence. 2 weeks later, Brigitte called to tell me I'd been accepted. I wired the deposit, $85,000 for the apartment purchase plus first year's fees, from my secret account. While this was happening, I also contacted Evergreen Realty, a discreet real estate firm in Springfield that specialized in quick private sales. The agent, a professional woman named Sandra Kim, came to evaluate my house on a Tuesday afternoon when Danny was at work and Kimberlyn was at a doctor's appointment. "Mrs. Whitmore," Sandra said, after walking through every room and examining the garden, "this property is exceptional. The location, the condition, and especially that rose garden. You've created something truly special here. In today's market, I'd estimate the value at $475,000. I told her I needed to sell quickly and privately without public listings or showings that might alert my family to what I was doing. "I have the perfect buyers," she said. "Roberto and Maria Rodriguez. He's a master carpenter, she's a master gardener, and they've been looking for exactly this kind of property for 2 years. They want to start a family, and they specifically want an established garden they can maintain and expand." The Rodriguezes came to see the house that Thursday evening. Maria took one look at my roses and started crying. "Senora Whitmore," she said, "this garden is a work of art. We would consider it an honor to care for these plants. Every bloom would be a tribute to the love you put into this place." They offered $460,000, cash, with a 30-day closing. But more importantly, they promised to preserve and maintain the garden exactly as I'd created it. My roses would live on, cared for by people who understood their value. That night, I called Dolores Chen and told her to draw up the contracts. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "are you absolutely certain about this? Once you sign these papers and leave the country, there's no going back." "Dolores," I said, "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." The final piece of my plan required the most courage. I needed to tell someone in my family what I was doing, but not Danny. I called my cousin Janet in Springfield, Earl's niece, who'd always been like a sister to me. "Janet," I said, "I need to tell you something in complete confidence, and I need you to promise me you won't say anything to anyone until after I'm gone." When I explained my situation and my plans, Janet was quiet for a long moment. "Vera Louise," she said finally, "that boy has lost his mind if he thinks he can treat you like that. Earl would be so proud of you for standing up for yourself." Janet agreed to be my contact person in the United States. She would receive my forwarding address, handle any legal matters that arose, and serve as my spokesperson if Danny tried to file a missing person report or claim I was incompetent. "Don't you worry about a thing," she said. "I'll make sure everyone knows you left of your own free will and sound mind." By the first week of May, all the pieces were in place. The house sale would close on May 15th. My flight to France was booked for May 16th. My apartment at Château de Lavande would be ready for occupancy on May 18th. I had one final task, saying goodbye to the people who mattered. The church ladies organized a spring tea at Ruby May's house on Saturday afternoon, May 11th. Officially, it was just a social gathering. Unofficially, it was my farewell party. 12 women gathered in Ruby May's living room, women who'd shared potluck dinners and prayer circles and quilting bees with me for decades. I told them the truth about everything: Danny's financial manipulation, Kimberlynn's psychological warfare, my fear of losing my independence, and my decision to start fresh in France. Not one of them tried to talk me out of it. "Honey," said Mrs. Charlene Sue Morrison, "you've spent your whole life taking care of everyone else. It's about time you took care of yourself." Mrs. Opal Dean Fletcher, who was 82 and sharp as a tack, raised her teacup in a toast. To Vera Louise Whitmore, who's proving it's never too late to choose courage over comfort. They promised to keep my secret until I was safely in France. They promised to look after my garden until the Rodriguezes took possession. And they promised to pray for my safe journey and happy new life. That night, I sat down at my kitchen table and wrote 2 letters by hand. One for Danny, one for Kimberlynn. I'd been planning what to say for weeks, but the actual writing took me 3 hours and several drafts. I wanted to be clear, but not cruel, firm, but not bitter. I wanted them to understand exactly why I was leaving and exactly what they'd lost through their own choices. Most importantly, I wanted them to know that I was nobody's victim. I had spent 67 years being the woman everyone else needed me to be, but I was about to become the woman I'd always been inside. The morning of Thursday, May 16th, 2024, dawned clear and warm in Branson, Missouri. It was the kind of spring day that made the Ozark Mountains look like a postcard, with dogwood trees blooming white against the green hillsides and the air smelling of honeysuckle and fresh grass. It was also the day I disappeared from my old life forever. I'd been awake since 4 o'clock, not from nerves, but from excitement. At 67 years old, I was about to board my first international flight, bound for a life I'd chosen entirely for myself. My suitcases were packed with carefully selected belongings: Earl's military medals, my grandmother's china, 46 years of photo albums, and my mother's hand-stitched quilts. Everything else, furniture, household goods, garden tools, stayed with the house. Ruby May arrived at 6:30 to drive me to the Springfield airport, her eyes bright with vicarious adventure. "I still can't believe you're actually doing this," she said, loading my luggage into her Buick. "When Frank finds out what Danny did to drive you away, he's going to be madder than a wet hen." Frank was Ruby May's husband, a retired railroad worker who'd known Earl for 30 years. The men of their generation understood loyalty and responsibility in ways that apparently my son's generation had forgotten. "Let him be mad," I said, taking one last look at my rose garden. "Maybe shame will teach Danny something that love couldn't." The drive to Springfield took an hour and 15 minutes. Ruby May chattered the whole way, updating me on church gossip and neighborhood news, carefully avoiding any mention of Danny or Kimberlynn. I'd asked her to wait until noon to call Pastor Williams with the news that I was traveling out of state for an extended period. By then, I'd be somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean. At the airport, Ruby May hugged me tight enough to crack ribs. "You send me a postcard from that fancy chateau," she whispered, "and don't you ever let anyone make you feel guilty for choosing yourself for once in your life." The flight from Springfield to Chicago was smooth. The connection to Paris was longer than I'd expected, 9 hours over dark ocean, but I spent most of it staring out the window and marveling at what I'd done. Vera Louise Whitmore, who'd never been farther from Missouri than Earl's family reunion in Arkansas, was flying to France to start a new life. Meanwhile, back in Branson, Danny and Kimberlyn were discovering exactly how thoroughly I'd outmaneuvered them. They arrived at my house at 10 o'clock Thursday morning, expecting to find me waiting with a packed bag for our appointment to tour Golden Sunset Manor. Instead, they found my 2019 Toyota Camry in the driveway and 2 sealed envelopes on the kitchen table. According to Ruby May, who watched from her window and reported back later, Danny's face went white when he opened his letter. Kimberlyn actually screamed when she read hers. My letter to Danny read, "Son, your father warned me this day might come, and I should have listened sooner. For 31 years, I believed that loving you meant saying yes to everything you asked for and never asking for anything in return. I believed that being a good mother meant sacrificing my dreams for yours and never expecting gratitude or respect. You taught me differently. You taught me that my love was something to be exploited, not treasured. You taught me that my home was your inheritance, not my sanctuary. You taught me that my independence was an inconvenience, not a right. I've learned the lesson well. The house has been sold to Roberto and Maria Rodriguez, a young couple who will care for my garden the way you should have cared for my heart. The sale closed yesterday. They take possession tomorrow. The bank accounts you've been draining are closed. The $78,000 you withdrew over the past 18 months was the last of my money you'll ever see. You're 43 years old with a baby coming and a wife who married you expecting to inherit a house you never earned. It's time you learned what your father and I learned at your age. That family is built through love and respect, not manipulation and entitlement. Don't try to find me. I've made sure you can't. I hope someday you'll understand that I'm not abandoning you. I'm finally refusing to enable you. Your mother, who will no longer be taken for granted." My letter to Kimberlyn was shorter but more direct. "Dear daughter-in-law, thank you for showing me exactly who you are. Your campaign to convince everyone I was incompetent might have worked on someone who doubted herself. Unfortunately for you, I'm Earl Whitmore's widow, and he taught me to think clearly even when I'm being manipulated. Golden Sunset Manor has a waiting list. Perhaps you'll need it someday when your own children decide you've outlived your usefulness. The Rodriguezes have promised to remove the artificial turf you suggested and restore the garden to its full glory. Some things are too beautiful to be improved by people who don't understand their value. I won't be providing the financial support you expected. You and Danny are young, healthy, and capable of supporting yourselves and your child without stealing from elderly relatives. Best of luck with that. Vera Louise Whitmore, who is no longer available for exploitation." Ruby May told me later that Danny spent an hour on the phone trying to track down where I'd gone, calling the airport, the bus station, rental car companies, and every hotel in a 50-mile radius. Kimberlyn was hysterical, demanding to know how they were going to afford the mortgage payments on a house they'd never actually owned. The real shock came when Danny called the bank to check our joint accounts and discovered they'd been closed. Patricia Hendricks, the branch manager, would only tell him that I'd withdrawn my funds and opened new accounts in my name only. "But she can't do that," Danny apparently shouted. "She's not thinking clearly. She needs supervision." "Mr. Whitmore," Patricia replied coolly, "your mother was completely lucid when she closed those accounts. She understood exactly what she was doing and why she was doing it." By Friday afternoon, Danny had involved the police, trying to file a missing person report. Sheriff's Deputy Mark Thompson, a young man I'd known since he was in Sunday school, came to interview Ruby May and the other neighbors. Mrs. Thornberry, he said, Danny Whitmore is claiming his mother may have been abducted or coerced into leaving. Do you have any reason to believe Mrs. Whitmore was in danger? Ruby May's response became legendary in our neighborhood. The only danger Vera Louise was in came from her own son and that grasping wife of his. She left of her own free will to get away from their financial abuse. If you want to investigate someone, investigate how much money they stole from her bank accounts. Pastor Williams backed up Ruby May's account when the deputy interviewed him. So did Mrs. Opal Dean Fletcher, Mrs. Charlene Sue Morrison, and every other church member who knew the situation. Mrs. Whitmore was completely competent and very clear about her intentions, Pastor Williams told the deputy. She was protecting herself from family members who were trying to manipulate her into giving up her independence and her assets. Within a week, it was clear to everyone in Branson that Danny and Kimber Lynn had tried to scam a helpless widow and gotten outsmarted instead. The gossip mill that had once sympathized with the devoted son, worried about his aging mother, turned completely against them. Earl's friends from the railroad were particularly harsh in their judgment. These were men who'd worked alongside my husband for 25 years, who'd respected his character and integrity. When they learned how his son had treated his widow, the reaction was swift and brutal. "That boy's got no honor," said Frank Thornberry, Earl's rolling over in his grave, knowing his son tried to steal from Vera Louise. Meanwhile, in France, I was discovering what life looked like when every day was chosen freely instead of dictated by other people's expectations. Château de Lavande exceeded every expectation I'd had. My apartment was on the second floor of the main building, with French doors opening onto a wrought iron balcony that overlooked terraced gardens and lavender fields stretching to the horizon. The furnishings were elegant but comfortable. Antique armoires, a cozy sitting area, and a kitchenette stocked with French pottery and crystal glassware. My neighbors were fellow Americans and Europeans who'd chosen to spend their retirement years in Provence. Margaret Ashworth, a witty British widow in her 70s, lived in the apartment next door. She'd moved to France after her husband died, selling their London flat and using the proceeds to buy a life of daily beauty instead of daily memories. "Darling," Margaret said over our first shared coffee on my balcony, "you've made the most brilliant decision. Life is far too short to spend it accommodating ungrateful relatives." The chateau offered optional activities, French cooking classes, wine tastings, guided tours of local markets and museums, but no one pressured you to participate. You could be as social or as solitary as you chose. After 46 years of saying yes to everyone else's demands, the freedom to say no was intoxicating. Within a month, I'd established a routine that felt both luxurious and natural. Morning coffee on my balcony while watching the sunrise over the lavender. French lessons twice a week with a patient tutor named Philippe. Afternoon walks through the village of Aix-en-Provence, where I'd discovered a flower market that reminded me of my garden back home. I'd also started volunteering at a local charity that provided meals for elderly residents who couldn't afford the chateau's fees. The irony wasn't lost on me. At 67, I was helping people my own age while living better than I'd ever lived before. The best part was the letters I received from home. Ruby May wrote every week, updating me on neighborhood news and church gossip. Pastor Williams sent monthly newsletters from First Baptist, always with a personal note praising my courage. Even my cousin Janet wrote regularly, reporting on Danny and Kimber Lynn's ongoing struggles. Their baby had been born in August, a healthy girl they named Madison. But far from bringing them together, parenthood had intensified their financial stress and marital problems. Without my house or my money to fall back on, they were forced to rent a cramped apartment above Danny's auto shop while struggling to pay bills on his irregular income. Kimber Lynn had filed for divorce in October, claiming Danny had misrepresented his financial situation before their marriage. She was seeking spousal support and child support while moving back in with her parents. "Serves them both right," Janet wrote. "They counted their chickens before they hatched, and now they're learning what happens when you try to build a life on someone else's money." The news should have made me sad. This was my son, after all, and my granddaughter I'd never meet. But I felt only a distant regret, like hearing about misfortunes that had befallen strangers. Danny and Kimberlyn had made their choices, and now they were living with the consequences. Meanwhile, I was living with the consequences of my choice, and those consequences included morning coffee overlooking French countryside, afternoon strolls through medieval villages, evening conversations with fascinating people from around the world, and the deep satisfaction of knowing I'd never again allow anyone to make me feel small, confused, or disposable. They'd counted on my weakness, but discovered my strength, and now they were facing a future they'd never planned for. 6 months into my French adventure, I barely recognized the woman I'd been back in Branson. Gone was the anxious grandmother who second-guessed every decision and apologized for taking up space. In her place was someone I'd never had the chance to be before. A confident woman who knew her own worth and refused to accept anything less than respect. My days began each morning at 7 o'clock on my balcony, watching the Provence countryside wake up in layers of golden light. The chateau's grounds stretched out below me like a living painting, rows of lavender creating purple stripes across rolling hills, olive trees silver-green in the morning sun, and the distant Alps providing a dramatic backdrop for everything. I'd traded my old routine of rushing to get dressed before Danny might call with another crisis for a leisurely morning ritual that belonged entirely to me. French coffee in my grandmother's china cup, a croissant from the chateau's bakery, and whatever book had captured my interest the night before. Sometimes I read for pleasure, mystery novels I'd never had time for when I was managing everyone else's life. Sometimes I studied French, determined to become fluent in the language of my new home. Philippe Moreau, my French tutor, was a retired literature professor in his 60s who'd taken on a few private students to keep his mind sharp and his schedule interesting. Our twice-weekly lessons had evolved into something more like friendship, with conversations that ranged from French grammar to American politics to the philosophy of starting over in your golden years. "Madame Vera," he said during one of our October lessons, "your progress is remarkable. But more than your French, your confidence has transformed. You speak now like a woman who belongs wherever she chooses to be." He was right. In Branson, I'd always felt like I was apologizing for existing. Too old to be relevant, too set in my ways to adapt, too much trouble for busy people to accommodate. Here in Provence, my age was respected, my experience was valued, and my opinions were sought out rather than dismissed. The other residents at Château de Lavande became my chosen family in ways my blood family never had. Margaret Ashworth and I developed a friendship that filled the loneliness I'd carried for years without realizing it. Every afternoon at 4 o'clock, we'd meet in the chateau's garden for tea and conversation that ranged from gossip about our fellow residents to deeper discussions about love, loss, and the art of reinventing yourself. "You know, darling," Margaret said one crisp November afternoon, "I spent 43 years married to a wonderful man who made every decision for us because he thought that's what husbands did. When Harold died, I realized I'd never chosen anything for myself, not what to eat for breakfast, not what color to paint the walls, not whether to stay in London or move to Timbuktu." She stirred honey into her tea and smiled. Moving to France was the first purely selfish decision I'd made in decades. Best choice of my life. I understood completely. For the first time in 67 years, I was living a life designed entirely around my own preferences. I ate when I was hungry, slept when I was tired, and spent my time on activities that brought me joy rather than fulfilling obligations to other people. The chateau offered a full calendar of optional activities, but the word optional was what made them appealing. Monday mornings, I joined a watercolor painting class taught by a local artist named Isabelle Dubois. She was a patient woman in her 50s who specialized in landscapes and still life, exactly the kind of art I'd always admired, but never had time to attempt. "Painting teaches you to see," Isabel explained during my first lesson. "Not just to look, but to really see. The way light changes color, the way shadows create depth, the way a single flower can contain dozens of different hues." I started with simple exercises, painting lavender stems, copying photographs of the chateau gardens, trying to capture the play of morning light on my balcony. My early attempts were clumsy, but Isabel encouraged experimentation over perfection. Art is not about creating masterpieces, she said. It is about expressing what matters to you. Paint what brings you joy. What brought me joy, I discovered, was color. After years of living in the neutral tones Danny and Kimberlyn had suggested would be more appropriate for someone my age, I was hungry for vibrant hues. My paintings exploded with the purples of lavender fields, the gold of sunflower meadows, the deep blues of the Mediterranean sky I could see on clear days from the chateau's highest terrace. Wednesday evenings, I attended cooking classes in the chateau's professional kitchen. Chef Antoine Rousseau was a master of traditional Provençal cuisine, who'd retired from a Michelin-starred restaurant in Marseille and now taught enthusiastic amateurs like myself. Cooking is love made visible, he would say, guiding us through the preparation of bouillabaisse or ratatouille or tarte tatin. When you cook with joy, people taste that joy. I learned to make perfect soup au pistou, fragrant with fresh basil and garlic. I mastered the art of saka, chickpea flour pancakes cooked in wood-fired ovens. I discovered that good olive oil, fresh herbs, and simple techniques could transform the humblest ingredients into something magnificent. The cooking reminded me of my early years with Earl, when we were young and poor, but happy to share simple meals together. The difference was that now I was cooking for the pleasure of creation rather than the obligation of feeding people who might or might not appreciate the effort. Thursday afternoons were reserved for exploring. Sometimes I joined organized tours to local markets in Apt or Avignon. Sometimes I simply walked through the village of Aix-en-Provence, discovering hidden courtyards and charming shops. Sometimes I drove my rented Citroën through the countryside, following winding roads wherever they led. One particularly memorable Thursday, I found myself in the village of Roussillon, famous for its houses built from ochre-colored stone that glowed like amber in the afternoon sun. I spent 3 hours wandering through narrow streets, photographing doorways painted in brilliant blues and greens, and finally settled in a cafe to write postcards to my friends back home. Dear Ruby May, I wrote, I'm sitting in a village that looks like a fairy tale, drinking wine that costs less than a McDonald's meal, and watching French grandmothers who are every bit as opinionated as you are. I think about you every day and thank God for friends who understand that sometimes running away is actually running towards something better. Fridays were my volunteer days at Les Amis des Aînés, a charity that provided companionship and practical help for elderly residents of Aix-en-Provence who couldn't afford private retirement communities. I helped with everything from grocery shopping to reading letters for people whose eyesight was failing. The work reminded me why I'd become a nurse 40 years earlier, the satisfaction of using my skills to make someone else's day a little easier, a little brighter. But unlike my nursing career, which had demanded everything I had to give, volunteering allowed me to help others while still preserving energy for my own life. One of my regular clients was Madame Beaumont, a 92-year-old former schoolteacher who lived alone in a tiny apartment near the cathedral. Every Friday, I'd bring her groceries and stay for tea while she told me stories about teaching in rural France during the 1960s. Mademoiselle Vera, she said one December afternoon, you have the gift of listening. So many people my age, they have no one who truly hears them anymore. Her observation touched something deep in my heart. For years, I'd felt unheard in my own family, my concerns dismissed, my opinions ignored, my voice gradually silenced by people who claimed to love me but treated me like an inconvenience. Now I was discovering the joy of being genuinely heard by new friends while also offering that same gift to others. The weekends were mine to structure however I chose. Sometimes I joined Margaret for day trips to markets in nearby villages. Sometimes I stayed in my apartment, painting or reading or simply enjoying the luxury of unscheduled time. Sometimes I participated in the chateau's social events, wine tastings, lectures by visiting scholars, concerts by local musicians. But my favorite weekend activity was gardening. The chateau maintained beautiful formal gardens, but residents were also offered small plots where they could grow vegetables or flowers according to their own preferences. I'd claimed a sunny corner near the kitchen garden and spent countless hours creating a miniature version of the rose garden I'd left behind in Missouri. French roses were different from the varieties I'd grown in the Ozarks, but the principles were the same: good soil, adequate water, regular feeding, and attention to each plant's individual needs. I started with 6 bushes, 2 Pierre de Ronsard climbers, 2 Mélande hybrid teas, and 2 ancient varieties whose names were lost to history but whose fragrance could stop traffic. Working in the soil again, feeling the sun on my shoulders and the satisfaction of nurturing something beautiful, I realized how much of myself I'd lost during those final months in Branson. Danny and Kimber Lynn's constant criticism had made me doubt everything: my competence, my judgment, even my right to pursue activities that brought me joy. "Too much work for someone your age," Kimber Lynn had said about my roses. "Dangerous," she'd called my latter work. "Obsessive," she'd labeled my attention to detail. But here in France, surrounded by people who understood that passion and expertise don't have expiration dates, my gardening was appreciated as skill rather than criticized as stubbornness. Chef Antoine often visited my plot to harvest herbs for his cooking classes. Isabel painted my roses when they reached peak bloom. Margaret claimed that the fragrance from my corner of the garden made her entire afternoon tea experience more delightful. I was contributing something valuable rather than being treated like a burden. The financial aspect of my new life was equally satisfying. My monthly expenses at the chateau, $5,200 for apartment, meals, utilities, and activities, were easily covered by my pension and Social Security income. The money from selling my house and farmland, invested conservatively through a French financial advisor, generated enough additional income to cover travel, art supplies, gifts for friends, and the occasional splurge. I was living better than I'd ever lived before, in one of the most beautiful places on earth, for less money than Danny and Kimber Lynn had wanted me to spend on institutional care in Missouri. More importantly, every dollar I spent was my choice. No one questioned my purchases, criticized my priorities, or made me feel guilty for spending my own money on things that brought me pleasure. When I bought a set of professional watercolor paints, no one called it wasteful. When I hired a driver for a day trip to the French Riviera, no one suggested it was extravagant. When I sent expensive Christmas gifts to my friends in Branson, no one accused me of being irresponsible with my finances. My money, my choices, my life. The contrast with my old existence was stark and liberating. In Branson, I'd felt like I was shrinking, my world getting smaller, my options fewer, my voice less important with each passing month. In Provence, I was expanding, learning new skills, meeting fascinating people, discovering parts of myself I'd never had the freedom to explore. I was 67 years old and finally becoming the person I'd always been, underneath the layers of other people's expectations. For the first time in my life, I was living for myself, and discovering that I was much more interesting than anyone had given me credit for. As I sit here on my balcony this morning, watching the French sunrise paint the lavender fields in shades of gold and purple, I can barely believe it's been 18 months since I walked away from my old life in Branson, Missouri. 18 months since I chose courage over comfort, dignity over duty, and self-respect over family obligation. The woman who was manipulated into questioning her own competence feels like a stranger now. The grandmother who apologized for taking up space, who said yes when she meant no, who accepted disrespect in the name of keeping peace, she's gone forever. In her place is someone I'm still getting to know. A confident woman who trusts her own judgment, who speaks her mind without apologizing, and who has learned that it's never too late to choose yourself. Yesterday, I received a letter from my cousin Janet with news from home. Danny's divorce was finalized in December. He's living alone in a studio apartment behind his auto shop, working long hours to pay child support and legal fees. Kimber Lynn has remarried, a man 20 years older who owns 3 car dealerships in Springfield. She got her big house and financial security after all, just not the way she'd planned. The letter also included a newspaper clipping. The Branson Daily News had run a feature story about the Rodriguez family and what they'd done with my old house. The headline read, "Local Couple Transforms Historic Garden into Community Showcase." The photos showed my roses in full glory, better maintained than ever, with new additions that complemented rather than replaced my original design. Maria Rodriguez had been quoted extensively. "The previous owner created something magical here. We feel honored to be caretakers of her vision. Every bloom is a tribute to the love she poured into this place." Looking at those photos, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with vindication and everything to do with continuity. My roses were thriving under people who understood their value. The garden I'd created as a memorial to the children Earl and I never had was now providing joy for a family building their own dreams. That's when I realized the most profound truth of this entire journey. When you love something enough to let it go to people who will treasure it, that love doesn't die. It multiplies. I think about the women who might be listening to my story right now, perhaps sitting in their own kitchens while coffee grows cold, recognizing something familiar in my experience. Maybe you're dealing with adult children who see your assets as their inheritance. Maybe you're facing pressure to downsize or simplify your life according to someone else's definition of what's appropriate for your age. Maybe you're being told you're too old, too confused, or too much trouble to live life on your own terms. If that's you, I want to tell you something important. You are not too old to start over. You are not too set in your ways to adapt. You are not obligated to accept disrespect from people who claim to love you. And you are certainly not required to sacrifice your independence to make other people's lives more convenient. I learned that the hard way at 67, but I learned it completely. Age is not a disease that requires management. It's not a reason to apologize for existing or to accept treatment you wouldn't have tolerated when you were younger. Your experience is valuable, your judgment is valid, and your right to choose how you spend your remaining years is sacred. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. The phone call I mentioned at the beginning of this story, the one where I said, "I'm sorry, you must have the wrong number," came 6 months after I'd settled in France. Danny had somehow tracked down my international number, probably through Janet, and called on a Tuesday evening during my art class. When I heard his voice saying, "Mama," with that familiar tone of desperation and entitlement, I felt nothing. No guilt, no anger, no impulse to rescue him from consequences he'd created for himself. Just a calm certainty that I didn't owe him anything. Not my money, not my house, not my presence, and certainly not my future. "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. I was sorry that my son had become someone who would exploit his mother's love. I was sorry that his wife had married him, expecting to inherit what his parents had worked 46 years to build. I was sorry that their child would grow up with parents who measured relationships by financial advantage rather than genuine affection. But I wasn't sorry enough to let them destroy my peace. "You must have the wrong number," I continued, and hung up. Margaret, who'd witnessed the call, raised her wine glass in a toast. "To women who know their own worth," she said, "and to those brave enough to protect it." That evening, I blocked Danny's number from my phone. Not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation. Some bridges need to be burned to keep toxic people from crossing them. 3 weeks ago, I received a letter addressed to Grandmama in childish handwriting. Inside was a crayon drawing of a house with flowers and a note that read, "I wish I could meet you. Daddy says you live far away. Love, Madison." My granddaughter. The child I'll probably never know because her father chose manipulation over relationship. For a moment, looking at that innocent drawing, I felt the first real regret I'd experienced since leaving Missouri. Not regret for my decision, but sadness for all the love that could have been shared if different choices had been made. But I've learned that you can't build relationships with people who see you as a resource rather than a person. And children deserve to grow up understanding that love is given freely, not extorted through guilt and manipulation. I wrote back to Madison, care of Janet, not Danny, sending French postcards and a small stuffed lavender bear that smelled like Provence. I told her that her grandmother lived in a beautiful place where she was happy and free, and that sometimes adults have to make difficult choices to protect themselves from people who don't treat them kindly. Someday, when Madison is older, she'll be able to decide for herself whether she wants a relationship with the grandmother who chose dignity over dysfunction. Until then, my door remains open to her while staying firmly closed to the parents who tried to steal my future. If you're holding on to relationships that diminish you in the name of family loyalty, please hear this. Family is supposed to build you up, not tear you down. Love is supposed to be freely given, not continuously earned through sacrifice and submission. And loyalty is supposed to flow both ways, not just from parent to child, regardless of how that child behaves. You deserve better. You deserve respect, appreciation, and the fundamental right to live your final decades however you choose. Don't let anyone convince you that expecting decent treatment makes you selfish or unreasonable. Standing up for yourself isn't abandoning your family, it's refusing to abandon yourself. I'm 78 years old now, still living in my chateau apartment, still tending my roses, still discovering new things about the world and myself. I paint watercolors that hang in the chateau's gallery. I volunteer with elderly French citizens who remind me that wisdom and dignity have no expiration date. I've learned to make perfect bouillabaisse and passable conversation in French. Most importantly, I've learned that happiness isn't something that happens to you. It's something you choose for yourself, every single day. Tomorrow, Margaret and I are taking the train to Nice for a weekend by the Mediterranean. Next month, I'm flying to London to visit her daughter and grandchildren who've accepted me as their honorary American grandmother. In the spring, I'm planning a trip to see the tulips in Holland, something Earl and I always talked about but never made time for. At 78, I have more adventures planned than I had at 67. That's what happens when you stop living other people's limitations and start embracing your own possibilities. To every woman who's listening to this and recognizing pieces of her own story, you have more power than you realize, more options than you've been told, and more life ahead of you than anyone has the right to limit. Use that power. Explore those options. Claim that life. You've spent decades taking care of everyone else. It's time to take care of yourself with the same fierce dedication you've shown to people who may not have deserved it. If this story of survival and transformation has touched your heart, hit that like button right now because each like helps my voice reach other women who need to hear this message. Tell me in the comments what gave you courage in your darkest moments. Your wisdom might be exactly what another grandmother needs to hear today. And subscribe to Grandma's Legacy because every woman deserves to have her voice heard, her story valued, and her courage celebrated. Because it's never too late to choose yourself. It's never too late to demand respect. And it's never, ever too late to start the life you actually want instead of the life other people think you should accept. Trust me on this. I'm living proof.